On the morning of March 31, 1986, a Boeing 727 operated by Mexicana Airlines was en route back to Mexico City. The flight number was Mexicana Flight 185. This was just the beginning of a busy day for the aircraft. Later on, it was scheduled to fly a round trip to Los Angeles. However, the flight didn't go entirely smoothly. This aircraft had recently accumulated a series of maintenance records. Pilots had reported severe vibrations in the throttle controls, discrepancies between cockpit altimeters, and a lack of response when operating the rear air stair mechanism. Just the night before, a previous crew arriving in Chicago had also reported uneven braking during landing. This prompted the maintenance team to conduct further inspections overnight. In addition to routine maintenance, they performed air bleeding on the braking system to address the uneven braking issue. After completing the work, the maintenance personnel signed off the aircraft as airworthy, clearing it for the morning flight to Mexico City.
That is, Flight 185 eventually landed safely in Mexico City at 7:12 a.m. The off-going flight crew continued to document various maintenance issues in the flight logbook and handed the aircraft over for the next flight, Mexicana Airlines Flight 940 to Los Angeles. This Boeing 727-200, built in 1981, had already completed over 10,000 flight cycles and had accumulated 13,675 flight hours by the time of the incident. At this point, the aircraft was parked at Mexico City Airport, and the maintenance team began addressing the problems recorded in the flight log. For the throttle control sensitivity issue, technicians inspected the relevant components and conducted static engine tests on engines 1 and 2, but found no abnormalities. Regarding the altimeter discrepancies, they bled the Boeing 727 static pressure system, checked the moisture trap, and instructed the next flight crew to monitor the altimeter behavior during flight. As for the tail stair mechanism, the lack of tactile feedback remained unresolved and was not immediately repairable. Concerning the brake system, the earlier flight crew had noted an issue with wheel number 2 on the left main landing gear. One of the brake rods within the brake assembly was missing. Upon inspection, maintenance personnel determined that the condition of the brake assembly was still within acceptable limits. Both the hydraulic and backup pneumatic brake systems were functioning normally. The B hydraulic system, which supplies pressure to the brakes, was slightly above the standard 3,000 psi, with an actual measured pressure of about 3,150 psi. Technicians noted this reading but found no further abnormalities and ultimately signed off the aircraft as airworthy, ready to proceed with its next flight. Inside the terminal, 159 passengers were completing check-in procedures for Mexicana Airlines Flight 940 bound for Los Angeles. Among those on board were Agustin Aguascalientes and Frederica Bonsanza, both professionals in the film production industry. They were working on what was then a little-known action film, Predator. Agustin served as the art director, and Frederica was the location manager. If you've seen the film and watched the credits at the end, you'll find both of their names listed. Predator was released in 1987, and the names in its closing credits became a tribute to their memory. On this flight, there was also a passenger named Graciela Florence, a former Mexicana Airlines flight attendant. She had once survived a crash in 1969, the tragedy of Mexicana Airlines Flight 801. That accident had left her with deep psychological scars, and she eventually resigned from her flight attendant job. Today, she was traveling with her husband and 2 children. Her husband happened to be the captain of this flight, Carlos Alberto Guadarrama Cistas. This time, the family was headed to Disneyland for a vacation. Flying with the captain today were 2 other crew members. First Officer Felipe Luis Piaget-Tola, age 34, Flight Engineer Ángel Carlos Penisco Vespinosa. At 8 a.m. local time, passengers began boarding the aircraft. The pilots were carrying out their pre-departure checks. They reviewed the maintenance log, noting the remarks left by the morning maintenance crew and the repairs that had been performed. Before departure, the pilots completed takeoff performance calculations. These calculations took into account not only the aircraft's weight, but also the runway condition, wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure, and outside air temperature. Using this data, the pilots determined the engine thrust setting and safe takeoff speeds. This allowed them to estimate how much runway would be required. By 8:40 a.m., the cabin doors were closed and the jet bridge was retracted from the aircraft. As per procedure, the crew requested pushback and engine start. The aircraft's 3 engines were then brought to life. Flight 940 was scheduled to taxi to runway 05 for a northeast departure. During taxi, the captain noticed that the aircraft seemed somewhat unusual. He remarked that the plane felt unusually heavy or sluggish to respond, as if it was having difficulty getting moving or accelerating. By 8:50 a.m., the aircraft entered the runway and the control tower cleared it for takeoff. The plane began accelerating down the runway, and at this moment, the captain again commented on the aircraft's heaviness and sluggish handling. The pilots had used the correct thrust setting and carried out the proper performance calculations, and all instruments were showing normal readings. For that reason, the captain did not order an aborted takeoff, but instead suggested increasing the engine thrust to full power. In the end, the aircraft only reached rotation speed 11 seconds later than expected, and it used more runway distance than planned. The Boeing 727 finally lifted off the ground. At the moment of liftoff, everything seemed to return to normal. About 10 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft reached the first waypoint, Toluca. That day, the crew was navigating using the ground-based VOR/DME station. After reaching Toluca, the plane turned right toward the northwest, heading for the next waypoint, Morelia. By this point, 14 minutes had passed since takeoff. The aircraft continued climbing through 29,000 feet, preparing to reach its planned cruise altitude of 31,000 feet. The crew began to settle in, ready for a smooth cruise phase, when suddenly a loud explosion tore through the aircraft. At the same time, the cabin violently depressurized, and the cabin altitude warning in the cockpit began to sound. In the passenger cabin, the oxygen masks automatically deployed. The air inside the aircraft was instantly sucked out through the rupture in the fuselage, escaping into the thin atmosphere at high altitude. With air density drastically reduced, the passengers were now in immediate danger of hypoxia. The aircraft had to descend quickly to an altitude where it was still possible to breathe. The captain and his crew reacted swiftly, donning their oxygen masks. The captain immediately ordered an emergency descent. He had to bring the aircraft below 10,000 feet as fast as possible to ensure the passengers could breathe normally. Every second counted. The pilots sent out a mayday call to air traffic control, requesting clearance to descend and return to the airport. The Mexico City ATC Center approved the flight's request to turn right and head directly back to the airport. However, the captain soon realized that they might not make it to Mexico City in time. He gradually became aware that the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and that engine number 1 appeared to have failed. At that moment, a flight attendant burst into the cockpit, shouting to the crew, "There's a fire in the cabin!" Flames were spreading rapidly through the passenger area, and thick smoke was filling the fuselage. The situation was deteriorating at alarming speed. The pilots realized they no longer had enough time to make it back to Mexico City. Flight 940 would have to land immediately. They re-established contact with the ground, indicating their intention to divert to the closer Morelia airport. But by this point, the aircraft's flight controls were nearly unresponsive. In their final radio transmission, the pilots reported that they were rapidly losing altitude. Flight 940 was plunging uncontrollably toward the Mexican countryside. On the ground, farmers and residents witnessed the plane's final moments, burning in mid-air. Just 4 minutes had passed since the crisis began. The fire had already melted the fuselage skin, causing catastrophic structural failure. The entire tail section, including the vertical stabilizer, horizontal stabilizer, all 3 engines and the passenger seating in the rear cabin broke away from the rest of the airframe. In the end, Mexicana Flight 940 rolled and plunged into a mountain valley. There were no survivors. It remains the deadliest accident in Mexican aviation history, and the worst loss of life involving a Boeing 727 anywhere in the world. Because the accident involved in-flight breakup, aircraft debris, personal belongings, and human remains were scattered over a vast area. Rescue teams recovered around 20 bodies from the wreckage. It was immediately clear this was a catastrophic accident. What was already known at this stage was that the aircraft had suffered an explosion, cabin decompression, flight systems failure, and an in-flight fire, ultimately leading to structural disintegration. Mexicana's accident investigators, with assistance from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, quickly set to work, determining the cause and sequence of events and documenting their findings in the accident report. To uncover the truth, we will examine the root cause of the explosion, how it occurred, and the destruction it caused. First, terrorism was ruled out. 4 days after the crash, a media office in Beirut, Lebanon, received a typed letter, signed by multiple organizations claiming responsibility for the downing of Flight 940. Notably, this letter was sent 2 days after another aviation disaster, the April 2nd TWA Flight 840 bombing in Athens. Although some groups claimed responsibility, the Mexican authorities quickly dismissed the letter's authenticity, as its statements did not match the evidence already in their possession. Through analysis of the flight data recorders, investigators eventually pinpointed the source of the explosion to the left main landing gear wheel well. About 32 kilometers from the main crash site, they found a large amount of debris, confirmed to be from inside the left wheel well. Among the fragments were actuating components from the landing gear doors, pieces of titanium alloy, and, more intriguingly, ruptured fuel and hydraulic lines. Further investigation showed that the explosion's location matched perfectly with the altitude point shown in the flight data, further confirming the wheel well as the origin. As a result, the bomb theory was ruled out. The wheel well is not easily accessible, nor is it a practical place to conceal explosives. If it wasn't a bomb, then what else could have caused an explosion in the wheel well? Let's take a step back and review the entire sequence of events. Much of it, to a large extent, was tied to remarks the captain had made on the ground. The captain had already noticed that the aircraft felt unusually heavy and sluggish to respond during acceleration. He mentioned this problem more than once, the first time during taxiing and again during the takeoff roll. To explain this, investigators explored the possibility of a dragging landing gear. They focused particularly on the condition of one wheel in the left main landing gear assembly. Such a dragging phenomenon could indeed explain why the captain felt the aircraft was heavier than normal and slow to accelerate. The Boeing 727 has 2 main hydraulic systems, System A and System B. These 2 systems are independent, but they also jointly power some key flight control systems. At the same time, each system is responsible for certain exclusive functions. For example, while both System A and System B serve the elevators and rudder, System A alone controls the extension and retraction of the wing flaps, nose wheel steering, the extension and retraction of the landing gear, and other auxiliary functions. System B, in addition to those shared flight control surfaces, also operates the in-flight speed brakes and the built-in boarding stairs for the tail cone door. And now, the special focus of today's investigation, the braking system. We need to take a closer look at the structure of the Boeing 727's brake system. Hydraulic pressure is regulated through a pressure control valve. This valve is operated by the brake pedals in the cockpit and by the parking brake handle. The aircraft is equipped with an anti-skid system. When activated, it uses sensors to monitor the rotation of the wheels. The anti-skid control valve acts as an intermediary controller, adjusting brake pressure to prevent the wheels from locking up. The system is also fitted with deboost valves, which can lower hydraulic pressure and limit fluid loss in the event of a hydraulic leak. On the Boeing 727, there are 4 deboost valves, one for each main wheel. Although the Boeing 727 also has an alternate brake system, the main brakes are normally powered by the System B hydraulic system. However, the two systems are interconnected, so if System B fails, System A can take over. Now let's look at the specific brake assembly structure. Large commercial aircraft typically use a multi-disc brake system. The brake assembly is mounted with a series of rotating rotors that spin along with the wheel. These rotors are mounted within the wheel assembly, while another series of fixed stator discs are interleaved between them, remaining stationary. When the pilots press the brakes, these discs are clamped together, transmitting braking force directly to the wheel assembly. This design, while generating tremendous friction force, also produces a significant amount of heat. Investigators believed that a malfunction in the braking system could be one of the root causes of this accident, and were eager to determine exactly what kind of brake failure had led to the dragging phenomenon. The accident investigation team sent the recovered brake components from the crash site to the manufacturer for further analysis, a company called Goodyear. The results were highly revealing. Investigators focused their attention on the number 1 brake assembly of the left main landing gear. Here, they found evidence of extreme heat damage caused by friction, most likely the result of brake dragging. This dragging led to the buildup of deposits on the brake stator surfaces. In other words, the brake linings had broken down and shed material. In fact, Goodyear,
At least 75% of the brake lining had detached. Some had adhered to the rotors, while others had fallen into gaps within the assembly. Over time, these detached fragments actually worsened the dragging of the brake assembly, further supporting the brake failure hypothesis. In addition, damage was also found inside the pressure-reducing valve on the number 1 brake line. Investigators sent all 4 pressure-reducing valves recovered from the accident aircraft to Boeing for analysis. However, Boeing could not determine whether this damage had existed before the accident or had occurred during the accident sequence. According to the investigation, the number 1 brake assembly had only been installed on March 18, 1986. We know that the captain had remarked the aircraft felt heavy even before taxiing onto the runway, and that on the day before the accident, another flight crew had also reported uneven braking response. From this timeline, it is highly likely that the problem began shortly after installation and progressively worsened, ultimately leading to the accident. The final investigation report concluded that, during the takeoff phase, the number 1 brake on the aircraft's left main landing gear dragged continuously and overheated, reaching temperatures of over 870 degrees Celsius. Because the aircraft was not equipped with any brake temperature monitoring or warning system, the pilots had no way of detecting the abnormal condition. After takeoff, this overheating increased the pressure inside the tires of the left main landing gear. These tires were filled with ordinary air rather than the inert nitrogen gas required in aviation. The high temperature reacted chemically with the oxygen in the tires, and ultimately, when the aircraft climbed to 29,400 feet, a left side tire exploded. The blast not only destroyed the wheel well, but also tore through the fuselage structure and ruptured fuel lines and hydraulic lines, leading to the number 1 engine. This caused a massive fuel leak that was ignited, creating a fierce fire. At the same time, the aircraft lost part of its flight control capability. Flames spread rapidly into the cabin and over the exterior of the fuselage, burning away about 40 meters square of the aircraft structure within 4 minutes and ultimately causing the aircraft to break up in mid-air, killing everyone on board. This accident prompted the aviation industry to reflect and adopt safety improvements. In 1987, the FAA issued a 10-line directive requiring that aircraft tires be filled with nitrogen gas with an oxygen content of no more than 5%.
By 1993, this had become part of the aircraft design standards, and civil aviation authorities around the world followed suit. In addition, investigators recommended improvements such as better heat detection systems, redesigning fuel line routing, and improving wheel well ventilation, enhancing flight safety on multiple fronts.